The issue is really what is the appropriate foundational theory of economics? And again, I'm somewhat handicapped in thinking about this because I know much less than I should about economics, but the kind of the outline idea is, first step is, what are the sort of atoms of economic activity? And then how do they build up to sort of larger scale phenomena? So, for example, one might think that an exchange or a transaction is an atom of economic activity. I don't know if this is the correct model, but let's say it's that. Then there's the question of, we have sort of a supply chain of to have this exchange, this transaction happen, the things, the goods, the agents, whatever involved in that transaction, whatever state they are in, some state, and they have to have that state is generated by previous transactions. And so there's something very much like our physics project. There's some kind of causal graph or something that represents the chain of causality of this transaction. This event is needs as its input things that are the output of previous events. So that's sort of one kind of thing. Then we have to ask questions about one of the questions is sort of how does, actually in a conversation that James and I were having maybe a week or so ago, one of the things that sort of came up is this question of how does an economy end up having increasing value over time? Or does it? I don't know, probably Fred has opinions about this. I mean, should one correctly say that the value of the world, the financial value of the world, is increasing through time?
Yes, and I would say, well, my first point to your, question about the atoms and the primitives of economics.
Yes.
We had some conversations about this before, and I think it's useful to go down and just watch, what humans do and we call economic activity, and we would definitely say, consumption is something, humans act in order to satisfy their consumption needs and wants. And in order to do that, they produce, maybe, produce or collect or hunt, and they exchange. They also steal from each other and they rob from each other. But they, I would say, we could think of these as primitives of economic activity. And if we think about, is the value of the economy growing apart from the financial value, which is a complicated thing? I mean, doing like national accounting to account for the value, put a number on the value of the economy is a complicated thing. But in the sense that, humans, societies in which economies grow have more consumption possibilities over time, and people, seem to be satisfied with having more options to consume things, and they make themselves happier. So it would be a measure of utility, of increased general happiness, that would map into saying that the economy is increasing in value over time.
So, I mean, there are a couple of questions here. So, I mean, I think James has been interested in the question of what does a bot economy look like if the actors are pure AIs. Another question would be, what does the ant economy look like? In other words, is there a notion of economy that is not just about humans? Can we take humans out of, what is a thing like an economy that doesn't have humans in it? Yeah, go ahead.
I like that idea. I mean, the question is, if you would look, if you do the, the usual thing of like being out of this planet and coming down to Earth and watch biological activity, would you identify things and other kinds of biological beings that are similar to what we call economic activity among humans? I think the answer would be definitely yes. And the other question would be, I mean, if you transition from non-human living beings to humans, are we, is our economic activity basically reducible to things that we see in nature? And could we say that, as a really external observer, that human economic activity is embedded in nature? And I think it would be really interesting to think these things from the bottom up. And I think that's kind of really promising. I think, I've tried to do that a couple of times, and I think it explains a lot of things.
Right. I mean,
yeah, the same thinking might be applicable to just like something like evolution, right? Because you still have transactions and production, and you have things going forward in time, things getting lost.
Yes.
So it feels to me like the natural biological economy is evolution, which is a bit of a longer time scale. But yeah.
well, it isn't necessarily. It's in bacterial evolution or tumor evolution happens pretty quickly. The evolution on the scale of species happens slowly. Evolution on the scale of or our friendly virus has been evolving quite rapidly over the past year. But I mean, a question would be, in biological evolution, is there an obvious analog of value, price, anything like that in biological evolution?
That feels like it should just be fitness, right? In a certain sense. So you would rather transact with another actor with a higher fitness value, because you can produce higher value of goods then. So it seems like kind of evolutionary fitness.
Is transaction here mating with the
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. So yeah, that's another level. Yes, I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about energy exchanges, which is what individual living beings do. They eat, they fight for resources. But that's maybe these are two different kinds of exchanges two different kinds of economic activities that we see within biology.
Sataras has his hand up and is asking whether he should just jump in. The theory was we were going to have very few people here, so we were just going to have an interactive discussion. But Sataras, do you want to make a comment here? Sataras, were you going to say something? We're not hearing you.
It seems we lost. I'm very sorry about this. Yes, I have similar questions to the previous ones as well. For example, I believe by definition that in any case that there is a finite resource on which something operates, an economy of this emerges. As a matter of fact, economy could be defined as the management of some finite resource in order to do something. The main difference here is, for example, between the economy of ants and the economy of humans, the difficult thing to separate the system from the one that theorizes about the system. Because as soon as you have, for example, for humans, a theory about how economy works, this is also part of the system, and the system changes. Something that the ants, for example, or the pigeons, or or other kind of flock behaviors cannot take into account. And maybe in this sense, a valid economy for humans would have to take into account the fact that there are people or agents knowing about how the system operates and change according to this. And maybe the final theory could be something like a fixed point, where whether you have the knowledge of this theory in the system or not, doesn't change how the system would operate.
Look, the confusing thing about human economic activity and financial markets and so on is that, yes, people learn. I would assume that ants learn as well to some extent. And I don't think that's a unique feature of, I mean, the evolution of strategies is something, but I suspect this is the wrong level, okay? I suspect that just like in thinking about physics, you can think about physics at the level where you have, mechanics and this and that and the other, or you can go to the very lowest level and build back up to that. And I think the thing that is interesting to do, because I think it's informed by our physics project, is to think about start economics from the very lowest levels. And what is the lowest level of economics? It's not obvious in physics. It's been unobvious until very recently that one can take physics and think about it just in terms of discrete elements and all these interactions between discrete elements and these kinds of things. And that from that one can build up something that looks like space and time. So I think the idea for economics is to just try it to see what do you look at, what are the atoms, what's underneath this. James.
Yes, I've been thinking about this question of the atoms of economic activity. And one challenge here, of course, is you'd like to be able to identify some set of primitives that is relatively uncontroversial and in some way subtends whatever kind of school of economics or even ideology that you're thinking of. That'll probably be the most effective kind of set of primitives. So this is what I was thinking. I was thinking and thinking about this with reference to the hypergraph rewriting rules that we're using in the physics project, right? So with these hypergraphs, you can create a node, you can destroy a node, and you can establish some sort of hyperedge between nodes. Likewise, see, especially for some historians of economics, you can really think of the development of economies and markets as in some way creating resources, exhausting a resource, or establishing some sort of transformation or equivalence between resources. So if you have natural materials, in some societies, they're not part of the economy, they're not part of the market, right? In some societies, you take natural resources and you actually turn them into some sort of marketable resource. And then what's interesting is thinking about the relationships and the transformations between them. On the one hand, this could be exchange, it could be trade. On the other hand, it could be engineering or creating tools or using different resources to build other ones. Yes. So I've been thinking about this in terms of primitives because in this case, exchange is not necessarily a primitive, nor is manufacturing. Instead, you have a more abstract understanding of relationships between resources, where resources is something you take from the environment and you actually make it an economic object, which is not always the case. And that's always a controversial issue.
Yes.
So what are you imagining? I mean, what is your literal idea for what, what is the, let me just by way of, let me just show you something. I think I showed, well, here, let me, just in terms of having a concrete level of let's just see here. Sorry, I'm just looking at yeah, here we go. Okay. This is this isn't the right thing, but this is just giving us some sense of this is a kind of a thing where you have, Bob has 6 tokens and there's some kind of process in which they exchange, tokens with Ivan here. And here's an event that causes additional, that redistributes the tokens and so on. And you can imagine something, what is this? This is, this is a more complicated example of the same kind of thing where you're just having a series of kind of events that do something to, in this case, I'm not very satisfied with having this idea of an agent with tokens. But so the question is, I mean, in what James is talking about, make something here to save something here. Hold on 1 second. In what James is talking about, what are you imagining? I mean, in a picture like this, are you imagining that what sort of the time evolution of an economy does something vaguely like this? But then the question is, what are the blue dots, so to speak? What are these things that are interacting with other things?
Well, it's not quite the same because at least the atoms I was talking about just now, they're not necessarily agents, right? And they're not necessarily tokens. They're a kind of a more basic set of primitives. So one aspect that we were talking about before is that perhaps because we're thinking about economics in terms of what you've been calling this kind of fourth epoch approach, where the observer becomes important. So I think that it would, in my view, lately I've been thinking about the agent comes in as an observer in terms of the economy. So if you have these kind of hypergraphs which are basically the creation, destruction of resources and the kind of transformations between them, then the observer comes in, as we kind of discussed before, as an observer is someone who is making these kind of observations regarding
Right. So the raw
value,
thing,
goods,
right.
things that value, goods that or services that are coming together in a manner that is somewhat computationally reducible and is something that an observer would actually want to buy, right?
Okay, so let's imagine that resources, you know, the underlying data structure is you know, is some representation of resources.
I would say that's a very interesting projection. It's not the whole, it's not the entire underlying data structure, but if you just look at what happens to goods in a very general sense, and if you follow the, you know, the transformations that humans apply to goods, you know, we may or may not include exchanging that. That would be a very interesting projection. I don't know if it would have, you know, the obvious analogies to the physics project models, but you know, if you just look at what happens to things, I mean, they get created. I mean, you know, some seed gets planted and grows and then gets consumed and becomes, you know, decomposed within humans.
Right.
I think that's a very interesting projection to follow.
But okay, but so I mean, one way to think about it is there are some set of resources and they evolve in certain ways. Some of that evolution is human induced, some of it is just the way of the world, so to speak.
Okay.
And then the question is, so what is any of this stuff worth? I mean, that will be one economic kind of question. So I mean, there's the natural course of evolution, so to speak, natural course of evolution of resources. And then there is the kind of the observer, you know, valuing resources, so to speak. And I think the thing that James and I have been talking about before, which I thought was pretty interesting, was this possibility that an important piece of that story is kind of how sort of how flat the foliations are. That is how, well, okay, that there's this distinction between the components of an iPhone and a finished iPhone. And this question of whether the observer is somehow taking each component of the iPhone separately and separately valuing each component, or whether they're aggregating them all together and assigning some value to the whole thing. So I mean, I think there's this possibility that over time, one is sort of abstracting more about the world and gradually sort of smoothing out one's way of providing valuations to things. So in other words, one's not looking at the individual components, one's instead looking at this kind of aggregated thing. I think James was about to continue and
oh, just one other wrinkle to this. So on the one hand, the foliations is an important aspect to think, especially thinking about observers. We're also trying to think about what the kind of analogs of the space-like development and the time-like evolution is for these models. So on the one hand, it could be the case that value overall, net value is increasing over time. That has a time-like kind of flavor to it. The other question is, and this has to do with observations again and foliations, the fact that valuation is consistent and that agents can agree on prices, even though you have all these resources being, say, destroyed and produced, and these equivalents between them are being established, agents can usually agree on prices, and they can also find that they observe products or services or infrastructure, what have you, where these rules are coming together in certain ways that they value. So these are the two questions. Value is growing over time, but also at each foliation, more or less, agents can agree on valuation and pricing. And then this is where the question of money might come in.
I don't think people in general agree on value, because one way of thinking about it is as soon as you agree on value, you do a transaction, right? So because it increases your value and their value, so both have a reason to do it. At the moment, there are thousands of houses for sale, which I don't think is valuable enough to me for me to buy them. That's why I'm not buying them. So I don't agree with that value. although other people will. So all the transactions not happening is people not agreeing on value, while transactions that are happening is what when people do agree. So I would argue, since there are more transactions not happening than happening, the general case is not agreeing on value.
Well, I think there is, I mean, this is an interesting discussion, and it goes all the way back to the medieval economic thought. And why do transactions happen? And is there a just price? There was a whole tradition of just price and proto philosophy of economics. And the point would be, I mean, this is a medieval philosopher's point, is that actually when a transaction happens, it is because there is disagreement on value, and the person who is, there is a disagreement that leads into a transaction. So somebody is getting something that they think is worth more than what they're giving on both sides. And so basically when somebody is bidding a price that is lower than what they think is the actual value, and somebody is asking for a price that is higher than what they think is the actual value. And you can just think about financial markets. You have bid and ask prices for securities, and you will only have a transaction, that is, you will only have a price, a screen price, if there is a transaction. But most of the time, and especially for liquid securities, or for when markets get stressed, that is when there is large disagreements about what the precise value of something is, then you're going to have very broad bid spreads and no transaction would happen. So I think the idea that price is something that is really assigns a value to something at that point is I mean, you can generalize out of that. Basically saying, price is what happens when there is a transaction, and transaction happens when both sides are happy with that particular price, and they can only both be happy with a particular price when they disagree about the value of the underlying the two underlying things that are being transacted. It may be two goods, or it may be goods for money.
Here's a specific case of this. Okay, so this is crypto market, Ethereum to Bitcoin trading. Okay, and this is the depth chart that shows these are orders of people who want to sell. I guess they want to sell Ethereum, right? Yes. And these are people who want to buy Ethereum. And so what this is showing is there is a certain volume of people. So at a price of 0.66 whatever, there are 1,000 people who want to sell at that price.
Yes.
And then over on the other side, there's a certain number of people. I suspect Fred looks at these kinds of things all day, but
well, this is what the market actually is. It's not just the priced transactions, but this is what a market is. Mm-hmm. Any market is structured like that.
Right. So I mean, so how do we think about this? I mean, this is, I'm just screen capturing this to put it in our notes here. I mean, this is, okay, so how are you thinking about this? I mean, in this question about the agreement about price, so there's a certain number of people over here who say, well, there's a certain number of people over here who say, I think whatever it is, Ethereum is only worth that number of Bitcoin. I mean, I still don't have a great intuitive sense of what's going on in a case like this. So Taras.
There's two different things that may happen.
Yes. Sorry.
Sorry. No, just go ahead, please.
Thank you. Well, this is a nice example of, I made a comment in the comments that maybe a transaction happens in the sense of the physics project, that when its individual user has some sense of predictability in a more general computational irreducible range or system, for example, or we have a pocket of reducibility, as Stephen put it in his keynote, in a general context of a computational non-irreducibility. For example, here it is a case where the meeting point is affected by, it's a very open system. Ethereum is a very open system. It is affected by news, by world events, even by tweets from Elon Musk himself. So it's we have two different people here, different windows, subjective windows of computational reducibility, so to speak, from their point of view. And the one thinks that not the current value, but the future of this value will be higher than what he's getting. And the other thinks that it will go lower.
So here's the challenge in all of this stuff, okay? My intuition is, so I know very little about economics, okay? But my intuition is, whatever we think we know now about economics, the level that we are thinking about economics based on sort of traditional economics is way too high to, you know, we need to think about things far below the current level. So, I mean, these ideas, you know, I suspect ideas like utility and all these kinds of things are way too high level. I mean, they're the same level as but sorry, Fred, you were going to say more about this picture and so on, and what the significance is.
I think first we are looking at something that is higher level in the sense that we're looking at purely trading markets. So nobody is actually storing or nobody is actually consuming Ether or Bitcoin. So in this case, you would have, you know, it's somebody who is actually trading Bitcoin or Ether for some other purpose, which is some other kind of consumption in the future. And there's two things, but really looking at this graph, there's two different things that are important. I mean, everybody who is bidding less or more, you know, everybody who's not at the mid price basically has some kind of idea, has some kind of, you know, objective with the price that they're presenting. And the objective may be speculative. They just think that, you know, in the future, they will be able to sell, you know, at this point, you will be able to sell so much Ether for so much Bitcoin, but in the future, you'll be able to repurchase your Ether for a higher price. And in the end, after this loop, you will have, you believe you will have in the future more Ether than you started with. This is like the trading cycle. Mm-hmm. But there is one thing that is really structuring in financial markets, which is arbitrage. So if somebody actually believes, I mean, there's many other markets out there. Let's say there is a third cryptocurrency out there, and basically you could do a three-way trade in the sense that you would buy some Ether with your Bitcoin, and you would exchange your Ether against the third currency, and then you exchange the third currency against Bitcoin again. But I mean, make an arbitrage trade.
Right. The possibility of arbitrage feels so deeply like curvature in space-time. It's you know, because basically you're going around a closed loop, and the question is, do you get back to where you started from again?
Yes.
And
yes.
in a curved space, you don't.
Right. So in financial markets, a lot of things get structured by the fact that when markets are liquid, one shouldn't say efficient, but when markets are liquid enough, all these loops get closed. So the price structure, the bid asks. So maybe somebody who is bidding a little bit lower than the price knows that if they get this price for Ether against Bitcoin, they will immediately or very quickly be able to do a trade that will close it. And,
right. So I mean, what that's saying is the process of arbitrage tends to reduce curvature. Because when there is curvature, there is, you know, then that's a, you know, I mean, how do we want to carry? I mean, there's what's the right thing to think about? I mean, it's basically, you could think of it as a Riemann tensor or something. I don't know. Jean probably has a good way to think of this. I mean, so, you know, let's say you're going around a rectangular loop in kind of asset space. What you're literally saying is the failure of the closure of that loop is a non-zero value of the Riemann tensor. I mean, that is if the although that implies a certain spatiality to, I mean, you know, when you have just individual assets, they are like discrete points, and perhaps, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I think sort of, you know, this, I think, gets us towards this thing that James and I were talking about before, about the observer and, you know, the flatness of foliations and things like that. The question is, what is the role, arbitrage, you know, what's the role, is there a relationship? Okay, so there seem to be two phenomena. One is arbitrage kind of, well, what really happens when you close the loop? Is it the case? Okay, there's a different phenomenon, which is which is kind of abstraction or bucketing of assets, which you could think of as a portfolio type thing. What do I mean by that? I mean that instead of buying the components of the iPhone, you're buying the iPhone. How does that relate to any of these kinds of things? In other words, in a sense, that's like trading a portfolio rather than trading individual assets or something. How should one think about that? I mean, is there a gain in value? Is it the case that one can think about sort of the progress of things as being the increasing portfolification, so to speak, of the world? That is, you might start with individual pieces of tantalum and and tin and whatever else, and they operate in individual ways, but then you sort of make them into coherent portfolios that kind of have, I mean, in the case of financial assets, a portfolio might be set up to have some, volatility objective or something. But is it the case that one can think about kind of the sort of the aggregation of assets, like making portfolios, and is there some intrinsic value? What, in a sense, what you're doing when you make an optimal portfolio is you're trying to reduce volatility, and in a sense that feels a little bit like, not quite the same thing, but is it like is that related to, well, see, this is where we don't really understand how value relates.
So doesn't this relate back to my the information theoretic way of looking at it? Since if you think of putting different resources together, you get that so since in many cases it's an irreversible process, then you get that you need some increase in another degree of freedom, which is usually some form of complexity, right? And if you do that, another way of thinking about it is by reducing the volatility, you reduce the information carried by that, right? Because if you have more volatility, that's kind of analogous to higher entropy. You can think of it as Shannon entropy, I guess, but it's still analogous to higher entropy. So by combining them, you lower the entropy, which is an irreversible process, and then something else must increase to kind of offset that entropy increase, in the same way that you get in computers that you need heat and whatever.
I'm skeptical, but I could be convinced here.
That's interesting, because this is portfolio diversification. This is not my phrase, okay? This is not my opinion, but the current saying about portfolio diversification is it is one of the few or only free lunches in economics, and that requires some premises, but it might be free lunch in the sense that basically you're adding value without taking it from anybody else. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game.
I see, that's interesting. So I mean, but just like one believes that the progress of technology and the aggregation of individual components into an iPhone is also adding value without taking it away.
Yes, I mean, there's a number of points, and I think if you think about the signals, the gradient, the price gradients, right? If you think about production, we're going from trade to production, and I think that's an important distinction. If you're really thinking about how much you can substitute technology for trade, that is, instead of importing things from abroad, you can produce them locally at a lower price because you develop some better technology that enables you to produce things at a cheaper price, and that replaces trade. So there is this tension of trade versus technology. If we're dealing with financial assets, that's a different thing. And in a sense, it's simpler because you're only thinking about trading. You can't really produce financial assets in the sense that I'm mentioning right now. But what these signals do, I mean, what these price gradients do is basically they organize human activity, human economic activity. So if somebody realizes that, you can basically take together all the components of the iPhone and put them together in another country, maybe Mexico now could produce, assemble things more cheaply than China, for instance, and that could be for whole number of reasons. It may be because labor costs are lower. It may be because there is a trade agreement between Mexico and target country. So what economic agents do is basically they follow these signals, and there is an element of information theory there. They follow these price signals so that they can operate in the sense they can close these loops that we were talking about. And in the end, what they get is more money. Money is one of the main functions of money is being a store of value. And what they get is a store of value that they can put. I mean, it's a very complicated thing if you look at all the, the layers of institutional apparatus that underlie all that process. But in the end, what somebody who is doing, international trade is doing, they're accumulating currency, and that currently, definitely going to go into these questions, these currency questions and money questions as well, but they're accumulating that for consumption or for reinvestment. There is a way of looking at these things that, I think it's promising, because that really maps into what actual human activity is. And just for the point of the bots, I think the easiest way to think about the way current economic theory is structured, like microeconomics, it's actually all AIs. They're all AIs. They've been bots all the way. The moment people started modeling economic agents as maximizing agents, they've turned them into bots. And only that they have this really simple maximizing behavior. You have two goods, and you have some kind of like utility function that makes you happier with some proportion of these two goods, and you're going to exchange in the market so that you get the best possible proportion of these goods, depending on how you start with. So what microeconomic theory and game theory are is basically modeling and simplifying these bots in such a way that you can apply the mathematics that's used, that people are, that economists are able to use and model things like that. But once you start thinking about more complicated bots, you just open up the whole box, and there is there's many different dimensions of economic behavior that could be modeled, perhaps in a more interesting way than just using traditional optimizing agents as what happens in microeconomics.
I think the thing that James is actually addressing is, in the world of the future, when humans are obsolete and it's just AIs trading things, what will they do? And presumably they will not be using elementary game theory. I mean, that's some.
Well, I wanted to mention automated market makers in this context, because you're talking about human activity and bots, and how does this concept fit there? So these automated market makers in DeFi, in decentralized finance, are these exchanges where humans don't trade against another human, but against a smart contract using a formula. So
yeah, that's an interesting question. How does it work in DeFi? Because how does I think it's the same kind of thing. You've got humans trying to trade. It's not like it's the same story as this. I mean, it's basically, this is an automated market, right? There's no, there's still humans trading here.
Yes.
Well, the bot, I mean, the automated, they're either going to identify a loop that they can close immediately, or they will, and that's possible because there's many different market venues, and that's where speed is important, because these loops don't, whoever picks up the dollar bill first gets it. So that's why there's an arms race to make things faster. So either they will identify a deterministic arbitrage possibility that will depend on speed and market access and technology, or they will identify a probabilistic profit arbitrage possibility by saying that, when these prices get out of sync to this degree, then I have a satisfyingly high probability that the gap will close in the future. So I'll just stick to the mismatch, to the trade until this appears.
Hey, actually, just a point of general information here. In actuality, how often do people find deterministic arbitrage opportunities in the markets?
I think very often. And the reason why I think very often is that markets, the hydraulics of markets is complicated. That there is differential market access to different players. So I think these are much more common than you would think just by idealizing frictionless, liquid, efficient markets.
So you think that our quant finance friends, that a decent fraction of the time they're finding deterministic arbitrage opportunities rather than probabilistic ones?
No, I would guess they go more for the probabilistic ones. But I think the more traditional people in finance, rather than the quants, would be the ones that would be chasing these deterministic probabilities. That's my guess.
Mm-hmm. But okay, let's see. James had a
because
comment.
finding the deterministic probabilities depends on understanding the structure of markets rather than just being a good modeler of what the markets do.
Because
so
you're saying the issue is the hydraulic type issues of you just,
yes.
Things like, for example, that, only, US citizens can't operate on the Binance, cryptocurrency exchange, and Chinese people can't operate on this exchange, and so on, and mechanics like that.
Yes. Or just, if you do foreign exchange, you only, the large banks have access to the markets, and they will, put their very, very small bid spreads, but, they will make money all the time. And that's a question of market access. So I would say traditional financial people have always, earned their living by arbitraging, by doing deterministic arbitrage over market structure. And quants will explore probabilistic arbitrage over more efficient. The quants like liquid markets, efficient markets very much, because that's what enables them to go in and out without having to deal with very large bid-ask spreads that are caused by market structure. So that would be my guess.
So actually, I noticed that Stephen McCurdy is commenting about deterministic arbitrage and crypto exchanges. Did you have something to say, Stephen, there?
No, you can do it by hand on some exchanges. So I would say when you see one exchange mispriced, like I've seen it happen, have done it, and I know of other people that do it. That's my only example. But that seems pretty deterministic.
How long does it last? Well, once you notice one of those things, how many minutes do you have to take advantage of it?
Minutes. It lasts. I'm so small in size that it doesn't matter for me, but I would say it exists and pops up across different exchanges for different securities. Even when you see Coinbase launching putting a new coin onto their system, that price, when you look at across South Korean exchange versus a Coinbase, it's obvious that the prices are not the same.
But how long does the price difference last? I mean, is it like in 10 minutes there will have been enough trades that went on to equalize the price between those exchanges, or does it last for hours?
I don't know. I think it's less than an hour.
Fair enough. I'm just wondering. I mean,
there's some interesting ones. I mean, last year was so crazy that lots of things happened that one should really make a collection. I mean, people who observe financial markets should really make a volume about all the crazy things that happened in markets last year. And two of them are relevant for this, for this conversation. Some of you may remember that at some point, oil prices went negative. The future, the WTI, the West Texas oil went negative. And that's because there was a futures contract that required delivery. And somebody who had this oil had to deliver it, or somebody would take delivery of it, and there was no place to put it. So the price went negative, and the people who could actually store oil somewhere, people scrambled to find places to store oil, because if they could just buy the oil at a negative price, take delivery, store it for a month or two, they would be able to lock in the price and sell the oil for a positive price 1 month ahead, or a couple of months ahead, depending on how much return you wanted. So this is a typical hydraulics issue, that somebody needed to take delivery of this oil, but people couldn't take delivery of it, so they couldn't buy it for this negative price. And there was the scramble and all, and it's, I know people who are actually trying to find places to store oil, but obviously the people who could actually do this were the big commodities trading companies, and that's precisely what they did. And the second one is gold. There was a rush because Switzerland closed down, and most of the physical gold is refined in Switzerland, and the gold refinery is closed. And there was, at the height of the pandemic, there was a rush for physical gold. So there was a huge arbitrage possibility for anybody who could actually fly gold into the United States, because there was a demand for physical gold there. So if you could just fly gold from anywhere into the United States, you could make a huge profit.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Okay. I mean, but these are things that are not, economic theory does not cover the question of, who can charter a plane type thing.
Well, that's what trading people do. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I think it is actually aligned with the nature of things.
Right.
I think another thing that we can gather from the arbitrage thing is, if we think about this as curvature and going in a loop in asset space, then value can't be a scalar. Then value must be a vector or a tensor or something for it to change during parallel transport, right? So it already suggests some higher complexity than is usually seen with, because value is usually given like a monetary value, right? Which is just a scalar.
Although it's a scalar as a function of various kinds. I mean, so in asset space, clearly, as you move around asset space, value is clearly going to change because the values of different assets are different. Now the question is, what you're saying, yes, you're saying if there's curvature in that sense, what are you saying here? Yeah, I'm not getting that completely, but let's see. James had some comment, I think, here also.
Well, part of the motivation for thinking about the bot economy is, I think that it makes more, say, urgent the question of understanding really how human observers work in an economy. If you want to have, say, a bot economy or a mostly automated economy that still accommodates humans or is hospitable to humans, then it might be necessary to understand how observation in the economy works, and that might be something that it might be a contribution that we can make. So I want to make two quick comments about observer. I mean, so one starting point is, if we're thinking about this with reference to the physical model, then it might help to try and understand the observer with respect to the whole economy, as opposed to particular arbitrage opportunities or particular trades or even particular markets in the economy. Now, one lesson that might be learned from, say, these predictive markets that have been developed, where people try and create these markets as information aggregation platforms. Some people, like, say, Robin Hanson, have even suggested that it could be used to shape policy decisions and this kind of thing, is that if a price moves, or if some agent makes a particular move within, say, a given market, they might possess certain information that compels them to do that. But that information could pertain to all kinds of other aspects of other markets and other aspects of the economy. And it can be difficult to disentangle this. So in some sense, this is why before I was talking about prices and how prices we can think about the relationship between observers and the entire economy in terms of prices, simply in the sense that, yes, agents, they might not always agree, there can be arbitrage, but in some way, agent behavior and the prices that correspond to that might be a way of thinking about the relationship between all these different aspects of the economy. Now, even more specifically, I think that in terms of the economic literature, in terms of thinking about agents and information, I think that Kenneth Arrow and what's called the Arrow information paradox might be a good place to start. Arrow's information paradox is basically this: if you're selling some sort of commodity, in many ways, especially now, this is somewhat of an old paper, especially now, in some way you're selling information, especially if we're thinking about these hypergraph rules where you have these different aspects that are coming together. And if many of those are intellectual property in one way or another, I mean, if you're buying a complex commodity it's a lot of information in that commodity. Now, for an observer, in order to value that commodity, you yourself have to know something about it. You have to be able to have some information about the commodity. And what Arrow was worried about is, in some sense, this is a kind of a leak of value, so to speak. And I think that this is probably an important aspect when thinking about how observations are performed. I think that there's some sort of value in how resources come together. This constitutes information, but the informer has to have some information also in order to be willing to buy the commodity. Now, what's interesting, if we take something like the iPhone or even a laptop as an example, I think part of why these products are successful is that in terms of the engineering, the design, the research, even the basic science that goes into them, is very, very complicated. But in the way that they're marketed, and especially because of how simple they are, I would say how kind of reducible they are to the observer can really appreciate the product without actually having that much information about the product. So in some way, the kind of reducibility of a product makes it so that the person who produces it can retain much of the information value, and the observers can want it, but they want it based on actually a very, very small amount of information. So these are two kind of basic aspects, I think, in terms of understanding the observers. One, relation, like price movements and agent activity could potentially capture information known about the entire economy, or at least many, many, many aspects of the economy. And they're, to use thinking about, say, branchial space, in some way they're entangled. And then also, and this is also related to the quantum aspect of the physics model. Yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting statement. So, I mean, the first point is that I agree that what is basically happening in a marketed object like the iPhone is it is turning a bunch of irreducibility. It is somehow combining irreducibility to make a reducibly understandable thing. I mean, it is taking, all of the complicated, in what we do in language design, it's all about taking this complicated underlying computation and packaging it so that people can understand it. And so I think I agree, that's a place where value is being added in some sense. Is, reducibility is creating reducibility is somehow adding value, which again comes back to this idea that somehow reducibility and value are related.
It's also protecting value in the sense that if everyone knew everything about the iPhone, they could probably make their own in a certain sense, or at least other companies could emerge and they would be in trouble. So in some sense, if you know all the information that goes into your products, but people are buying them not because they understand how the whole product works, they don't have all the information about the product, they just have some sort of reducible representation of the product, then economically that'll be advantageous.
Right. I mean, that's interesting because I had a different point of view that the irreducibility of the network of transactions in a market could be what leads to the sort of the robust sense of value in the market. And this is kind of an opposite. Somehow what is the relationship between these two things? I mean, that is a market, the very complexity of a market prevents you from sort of trivially untangling the market. It gives one but I think you were going to make another point. So this is interesting. Okay.
I don't think that those are exclusive. I think that there's some relationship between the irreducibility of the market and say how that relates to all these price movements and arbitrage opportunities, and how agents are making these kind of decisions, which in some way represent what's happening in the market, but not completely. And then also the produce of commodities, or perhaps even services that are in some way reducible. I mean, if you could think about this, say in branchial space, where there's something that's underlying, and then observers are still able to make reducible observations, that might be a step in the right direction.
So in a sense, what you're saying is the very concept of a price is a piece of reducibility on top of a trading type market. In other words, it could be the case that people are just looking each other in the eye and deciding whether to make trades. That will be but in fact, you're summarizing people's view about that market by giving a price. And that's,
there's a bunch of traditions and pieces of thought in economics that go precisely in that way. I mean, it's not just Arrow. We can think about, you know, Hayek and information being decentralized. I think, I mean, I'm not, you know, familiar with all the physics concepts, but I know that people in price theory have made connections to thermodynamics in terms of like reducing information about the system to an individual point. And I think that the main issue is that our markets, would markets be so efficient that we go back, I mean, let's just keep the hydraulics of not only of financial markets, but of the real economy in mind. Our market's so efficient that how far would this information actually spread back to all different markets and all different production structures? I mean, if you're really seeing a localized price, just the thought exercise would be how, you know, how far could this information actually possibly go back? I mean, if you have an idealized general equilibrium model, then, you know, everything is in equilibrium, everything is connected to everything. But in practice, how far back this information spreads is questionable. But I think this, to the second point that you mentioned, I think just for understanding the primitives of the economy, there's a different, the value of the iPhone versus components is something quite different for the retailer and for the consumer. Let's imagine you're a retailer. If you're a retailer, the iPhone has a resale value, because what your utility, the utility you're getting out of the iPhone is basically the money that you're getting, you know, the profit that you're making by buying the iPhone or buying the components and putting it together and selling it to the consumer. The value for the consumer is something different. The consumer is exchanging their money and getting the experience of the iPhone, and that's a different kind of value. And I think it's relevant to keep the two kinds of value, the exchange value, the consumption value, they interact. And a lot of the interesting phenomena and the topic that we're talking about comes from this interaction. And the theory would be, I mean, one way to looking at it would be that, you know, basically the consumer has their preferences, and their preferences can be very tricky, as, you know, we've seen discussions in the chat. But basically what everybody else in the chain, in the whole production and distribution chain is doing, is basically translating back the value that consumers are giving to the iPhone, the ultimate consumers, people who are buying them for, you know, the videos of, you know, all the apps. And the retailer is saying, you know, there's high demand for this, I'm able to charge this price, so I'm able to pass, you know, I'm able to buy these things for a higher price from the producer. And maybe somebody else in the supply chain is realizing, you know, I can replicate this. Maybe it's not going to be as good as the iPhone that I'm selling, but it's going to be, you know, a cheaper product, but still I will have a nice arbitrage opportunity there. So I think the interaction between the ultimate value, which is consumption value, and all the intermediate steps, which involve trade, technology, and production, this is really relevant, because what you're seeing basically is a lot of teleological behavior among humans. Humans have these objectives, and they desire something, and they consume something, and everybody else in the production and distribution structure is somehow adjusting their actions so that they profit from this ultimate well of convergence of desires, that is the consumption value.
See, I think, but aren't you assuming something when you say ultimate consumption value, like a cryptocurrency that is never used to buy anything in the real world? Do you define, are you inventing a consumption value for that cryptocurrency? Or is that thing just sort of floating in the air with no ultimate value?
Sure, it would be the equivalent of somebody who holds a stock because they like the company, but not because they intend to sell it for a higher price in the future. But
so how do you identify that as consumption?
They derive pleasure from the fact that they are shareholders of Apple or, you know, Tesla. And they're happy with being shareholders of Tesla, but they don't really care. I mean, deep inside, they don't really care if the price, you know, if how much of a profit they will make in the future. Or even, I mean, just to be a little, I mean, this occurs to me. I mean, if you buy a company because you think the company does good to the world, and this is a very serious thing in the economy at this point. I mean, ESG is a very serious thing.
Anyway, sorry, we Fred, you
well, yeah, I was just making the point that there is an interaction between the exchange value and the consumption value. It just adds to complexity.
Fair enough, but let's see. So looping back, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, we're still, let me just share my screen again for what it's worth. Okay, I mean, the challenge here, let's see, I think Sotiris had a point. Is this relevant to the current flow? Sotiris?
Yes, it has to do with two previous points, but it, I think, has to do with the production of reducibility that also James, I think, talked about. I think one of the key issues, or one of the helpful concepts one might take into account, is the concept of the so-called bounded rationality, the inability to predict from a certain point onwards. So, for example, if we had, let's say, a bot network, the question, this is pertinent to the question Stephen did a while ago, one would expect that in trading between these bots, one interesting question, I think, would be whether the bots will exhaust their computational capabilities and then fix standard behavior, or if something else will happen. For example, if we have a network of bots that are not Turing complete, or the program they're running is not Turing complete, and maybe it's not Turing complete because it has a bounded time to make a decision, not necessarily because of memory limitations. Will it evolve up to a point or not? Or if we have a system, a network of bots that is Turing complete, for example.
So I mean, in traditional economic theory, right, there's, you know, this, maybe Fred or somebody else can comment on the whole bounded rationality. I mean, there's a whole, you know, in the 1980s and beyond, there was a whole set of analysis of economics in the case of bounded rationality. Is that okay? Can you do a quick summary? Somebody, maybe Fred can do the quick summary of what the history of this.
Does James want to have a try, or
James or
No, Fred, please go ahead.
yeah? So basically, I mean, the way people have been modeling markets, I mean, the way you started building mathematical models of market would assume that everybody could see everything, and that everybody could calculate, you know, could make, you know, unbounded calculations upon what they were saying. And if you had, you know, if you had markets, everybody would have access to all market prices. Everybody could be able to, you know, calculate the you know, their optimal position within, you know, given exchange prices and given goods, and you would reach an equilibrium. Everybody would do their unbounded calculations, and you would reach equilibrium prices for all goods in the system. And then,
so just so I understand that, I mean, basically, in the sort of game theoretic sense, the payoff matrix is something given from the outside of the system as just, here is the payoff matrix, and everybody will achieve the optimal value given that from the outside defined payoff matrix. Is that right?
I mean, if you move to game theory, basically the payoff matrix is known to everybody, and everybody's strategies are known to everybody. So you reach an equilibrium when you know everybody else's strategy, and nobody in the whole system has an incentive to change their own strategy, given that everybody else is following their specific strategies. And that would be a equilibrium. So every single agent would be able to do all the calculations to reach this specific equilibrium.
But well, how do you know what the equilibrium is? I mean, it's just thrown from the outside. Here's a payoff.
You do an existence proof, basically. I mean, you just, you know, you say there will be, you know, the Nash, the whole Nash equilibrium is, you prove that there exists an equilibrium, and the way this is actually calculated is actually pretty complicated.
No, I understand that, but I mean, the question of what the question of what the payoffs, what the, you know, what that whole matrix is not something that theory addresses. No, that theory is just saying there is such a matrix represented by different kind of
payoffs.
Yeah, right. But it's not, I mean, in a sense, what one wants is a theory that goes beyond that doesn't just say, given this, you know, ex machina kind of matrix, this is how the agents will behave. One wants something which talks about what actually generates that matrix. So yes. Is this, I mean, how does that relate to what people say in economic theory, so to speak? I mean, the generation of that matrix of what, you know, what characteristics of that matrix does economic theory talk about?
I think in the simplest case, it's a given one. I mean, there will be more complicated, there may be repeated, like you have repeated interactions, and you're going to have, a dynamic. You have, you do something at this round, and then you have the next round. And I think you're moving into, the structures of games and things like that. But basically, you would think that, people have enough computing power to figure out, they know everything. First, they have, it's not bounded rationality, it's also bounded, unbounded rationality in terms of unbounded computing power, but also unbounded knowledge in the sense that you actually know what everybody else's payoffs are and what everybody else's preferences are.
Right.
So
but I mean,
think,
yeah, right. But I mean, what we're saying there is, I mean, what we're trying to understand is if we're trying to make a deeper model of the economy, we're trying to say, what is the generator? I mean, it's like in our physics project, like in causal set theory, you just throw down the points in space-time and say, this is how it works. That's in a sense what you're saying is being done. And then you say, given that you've thrown down the points in space-time, here's what the causal graph looks like and all that kind of stuff. That's in a sense what you're saying in this, traditional model of general equilibrium model of economics. Is just, there is some whole set of payoffs and so on that exists. We don't know where that comes from, but now we can look at the dynamics given that that exists. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. Yes. But then the second thing is that people will not only look at deterministic structures, but they would throw in, what happens if you're doing, this over successive periods of time, and what happens if you move from deterministic to non-deterministic systems. And basically what, the big discussion, just to go back to the history of things, there was, this in macroeconomics, there was this discussion about, do you have rational expectations, and the model there was this rational expectations versus, bounded rationality discussions, which was, we can make very nice models if we assume that all agents in the economy actually know precisely what is the underlying model of the economy. And they reach an equilibrium, their decisions, the decision making reaches an equilibrium once everybody knows not only what everybody else is doing, but they also know what the underlying mechanics of the economy is. Right.
That's go ahead.
And the point is that not only that's, if you then go to the way these models are actually implemented, they're computationally pretty complicated. So basically what people figured out is that, you're somehow doing mathematics here, but if you move to the computational side of things get very complicated, and you're running into, you're actually assuming computational powers from agents that are not really feasible.
Right. Well, both computational powers and information gathering powers, I think,
Yes.
Which might be two different things. Because
Right. Yes.
information gathering might be to do with light cones and what region of the economic system is causally connected to you and so on, versus what is kind of a surprise coming from the outside. And computation is the actual processing of that information. So both of those might show up.
And the other point that I find really interesting in that respect is the efficient markets. Is the idea of efficient markets. Like the markets, financial markets in this case, will actually accurately price financial assets given the available information. So it's a little bit of a circular reasoning, but basically the prices that you actually observe in financial markets are the best estimates of prices given the available information. But what is not clear, what never really gets discussed is what is actually the underlying algorithm that markets implement that enables them to make these estimates. And I think that's it's connected to the kinds of things that we're talking about, and that's probably the most interesting question in financial theory, is that what is actually being implemented by financial markets? What is the valuation algorithm that's being implemented?
Well, right. I think that comes back to the core question that we're trying to address here. Let's see, Sotiros and then James.
And the other comment I wanted to make was that a difference between portfolio and having an iPod, which is, I think it must be a little bit interesting, that in a portfolio, usually we're looking for diversity, as Frank told us. Frank, I think is the name. While in an iPhone or in any technological objects, we have an accumulation of objects from which emergence of new quantities and qualities and behaviors can emerge. This is something we don't usually have in a portfolio.
I think there's a closer analogy than you think, because a portfolio, when you buy, some mutual fund or something, it has, it says this is intended to be a, I don't know, low risk, high yield, blah, blah, blah thing. That's a summary. Behind the scenes, traders and quants and portfolio managers and so on are trying to make that description be what's correct. Just like when you buy a phone, it's like, this is a smartphone. I mean, the idea that you can then build on, I mean, that's a different issue, is given that you have made an abstraction, you can then build on that abstraction. And that's surely what happens in finance as well. Like, the consumer price index, let's say. The consumer price index is a messy thing composed of lots of pieces. Once you have the consumer price index, you just plug that in as a component in, doing a lot of other kind of financial things. So I think it's really the same kind of thing. I mean, I think it's, interestingly, the other type of thing that might be the same is organizations, right? To making, rather than having the individual people do their separate things, they form a company or they form a guild, and then that, or more accurately, probably a company in this case, and the company then does something rather than those individual people. So it's this story of aggregation as a way to do that. Let's see, James, you were going to make a comment, and I noticed Alison put something rather interesting in the chat here.
One interesting, relatively open question in the physics project is exactly is the question of foliations. You can have different Zerbers can occupy different foliations. In the physics project, we still have to. There are different candidate hypergraph rules that we're considering, and then the question is exactly what the foliation would be that would describe, say, an anthropic reference frame in different respects. Now, the question is, in economics, if it's similar, then there could also be different foliations. And this is really just an open question, like an intuition. But I do wonder if much, or at least some of the literature on rationality and game theory has in some way to do with agreement amongst agents on a common foliation, as opposed to something about the underlying, say, economy. It's just an intuition, but that's something that,
right.
A
different foliation of the economic space, in some sense, might correspond to utterly different perceptions of what's valuable. I mean, somebody might show up, in Polynesia, it might have been cowrie shells, and then the Western whatever show up and they don't care about cowrie shells. That to me, sort of, there does seem to be some intuitive correspondence between different perceptions of value and different kinds of foliations. And what you're saying is that in some sense, when there are two agents in a market, they might have different agents in the market might be foliating the market in some sense in different ways. And the question is, what is the correspondence between those? Okay, so analogy would be different observers in the physical world who perceive that the same things happen in the world, which they might not. The fact that they do, we think, is related to this whole causal invariance property and so on. The fact that it doesn't, so in some sense, so maybe one of the non-trivial parts of economics is, why do people have consistent views of value? Why do two people, it's not obvious that two people, why do different people perceive the same objective value, perceive similar objective value? Because it might not be the case. And in fact, it isn't precisely the case, but it is approximately the case that people, economies wouldn't work if people didn't have some notion of some kind of objective value, I think. In other words, if everybody valued completely different things, then would an economy work? I think not. I think there wouldn't be any, I mean, it would be a very, well, what would it be like if people valued utterly different things? You know, you go to the market and somebody wants, you know, right now, it's like, you know, roughly people want to buy the same goods, whereas somebody might say, I don't care about, you know, that part of the turnip plant. I want the, you know, the flower at the top of the turnip plant, but sorry, nobody's selling that part. You know, in other words, it could be a, you know, so the claim would be that some notion of consistent objective value is necessary for, I mean, that is awfully similar to the problem of quantum mechanics. The core problem of quantum mechanics is, why do people think that, you know, in a probabilistic setting, why do people think that definite things happen and have some degree of agreement about what happens? Because it's not self-evident that they would.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, people objectively have different assign different values. I mean, I'm in Brazil. I want to watch, you know, if I did, I would, you know, maybe watch soccer. If I were in the US, I would watch football. And people are, you know, consumers are assigning different values for, you know, the pay-per-view, the two different pay-per-view streams. One question that I ask myself is, then that's a different thing. It's the exchange value within financial markets. And question would be, if there is an analogy to what I'm going to say, is that, I mean, is it possible to have two different arbitrage loops within financial markets, so that for both sides, so both sides in a trade, because financial markets are disconnected, they're not perfectly connected, would both sides be able to do their own arbitrage trades and both have a profit by exchanging things at a given price? And I think my intuition would be that, yes, that's possible. And that's what generates a lot of trading activity.
Well, and there's also the question of what is the kind of analog of a continuum limit? What is, you know, is your hydraulic story, you know, is sort of hydraulic, whatever, friction or something, is hydraulic incompleteness,
yes,
like discreteness, so to speak, like not being at the continuum limit. Because, you know, it feels like by the time people are specifically, you know, by the time some guy has managed to charter the plane to fly the gold and has used the last charterable plane, that's kind of like you know, you ran out of the continuum for the economic system. Let's see, there was a comment here from Alison about this flow curvature method. What is this? Is this a general, what on earth is this? Alison, do you want to say something about what this is?
Right. So I don't feel like I know much about economics, but my idea was that if we could model economics as a dynamical system, then if we were to analyze the geometry of this thing, which in this flow curvature method is called the slow manifold, it could give characteristics of fixed points and equilibrium and things like such.
I see. So this is basically saying, given that you have a manifold, this is asking,
given a dynamical system, construct a manifold, this manifold called the slow manifold, and then deduce equilibrium and things like such from just the geometry of this manifold.
Right. Well, I mean, I think
that's game theory. Nash equilibrium existence proofs are proved with, I think, Brouwer's fixed point theorem, for example. So I think, yeah, you stumbled upon a part of game theory.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. Didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, game theory, right? That is the dynamic game theory story, right? Is basically this kind of differential equations on, yeah. I mean, I think, let's see. I'm just looking at these comments. So, Satiras, did you have another comment? And then.
Yes, about the objective value, I would comment that it is more especially in free markets, an emergent property. Like, for example, referring to Adam Smith's invisible hand. If I have a personal value and you have a different value, I am made to come closer to you and you're made to come closer to me in order to have an exchange. Otherwise, we will not have an exchange. For example, like in the Soviet Union, we had the state imposing an objective value. It said that the bread costs one currency point, for example, and then the whole economy adjusted from this on. While in a free market, we have a constant dynamic behavior, and we start with subjective values, but then our interaction make us settle on some objective value. So it's more like not something a priori, but I think it's something emerging from the way we work.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't understand the relationship of that to what we're dealing with. I mean, I understand that. I mean, another question is, how can different economic ideologies still all operate in some sense? Is that an interesting fact?
Well, that's a huge discussion. There's a lot of I think every time information technology gets better, there is the question of whether the balance between decentralized and centralized decision making, and this is a discussion that has happened throughout the 20th century. And the economic policy timeframes that we look at, if you just look at 20-year economic policy timeframes for economic policy, things look, there is the consensus lasts for a couple of decades. But if you look at longer time periods, the consensus tend to be completely different, and they go, the pendulum goes in both directions. And
all right, so what's the analogy for us of centralized versus decentralized decision making? Is it something to do with foliations? I mean, again, we keep on circling around this question of what is the underlying data structure for economics? Because if we knew that, then one possibility. All right, so just to throw out various possibilities, another thing is, okay, by analogy with the physics project, there is the possibility that all possible transactions could be possible, so to speak, in some kind of rulal multi-way graph. There could be all possible transactions could occur, but an observer could be sampling. I mean, the way to think about it is an observer is sampling only some collection of those possibilities that have some degree of coherence to them. I mean, that's one, one of the issues is, because in this model, what you were just describing in sort of the traditional general equilibrium model assumes that from the outside, there is some notion of sort of a bunch of values or payoffs or whatever that is just being delivered from the outside. And the question is there, in the case of where does that delivery from the outside come from? So one possibility is that, in fact, all things are possible, but the observer is the one making the decision about which ones will be actual, so to speak. I mean, that's one possible view of it. To make that useful, you have to know certain things about the observer. So, for example, in the case of physics, I think this consciousness constraint of sequentialization of time is important. One possibility is, is the analog, what are the characteristics of an economic observer? So
in this sense, is an economy a observer? I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost.
No, I think, well, it's a good question. I mean, I think rather it is an individual agent in the economy that is an observer. And the economy—
But the individual agent doesn't have complete control over what parts of the multi-way system is sampled, right? Because you have different observers and they each, you have different agents who have different effects on which multi-way path we take. But kind of the entire economy as a whole is doing a computation which decides which multi-way path the entire economy is going. This is the argument I want to make.
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, try say that again. Let me understand that again. So you're saying that assume there is a multi-way graph of all possible goings on in the economy. Then, okay, the argument I was going to make was a possible characteristic of an observer in the economy, of an economic observer, is, possible characteristic is there is is sort of everything can be bought for money. Because I don't think that's an obvious feature of, in other words, is it the case that the hypothesis, if you're just saying things are being bartered, it's not everything, it's not clear that everything can be bought for money. It could be the case that the only way to get a cowrie shell is with another cowrie shell, and that there's no other thing that can be exchanged to get a cowrie shell. And so it is a tremendous simplification of an economy to say everything can be bought for money, isn't it? It could be the case that only certain, the alternative is only certain barters are allowed. James.
Well, I think this is another good reason to think about the possibility of a bot economy. So yes, I think potentially with a bot economy, you could have these different kinds of rules being in play, this kind of ruleo economy. And maybe you could even think of the economy as potentially following different kind of rules. But then the question is, how exactly would these bots actually produce output that is one, reducible for some human observer, but also something that a human observer occupying a particular reference frame will come to value. And it could be the case that these bot economies could cater to different foliations or to different reference frames. But much to Jean's point, you could have, I think as soon as you think about it in terms of bots, you can start to think about economic activity that's quite different than the kind that we understand today. And that can even help for us to appreciate the fact that perhaps our experience up till this point with economic activity has been it's been restricted to some foliations and some observations that we've had, but it could reach wider than that. I'll just mention one other aspect of this, which is von Mises had this idea of catallaxy, which is basically the formation of markets. Von Mises didn't really like the idea necessarily that an economy is some a priori that you presume. Economics, right? I'm sure our Greek friends will know. It's basically oikos and nomos, like the laws of your household originally. But von Mises didn't want to think of it as being, he didn't like the term economics necessarily, and he didn't like to think of it as an a priori. He wanted to understand how agents actually come to form markets in which they basically agree on value and on prices, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it could be the case that you could model an economy in this multi-way sense, especially if you think about bots. Then the question is, how do those bots actually produce activity so that you can have markets with observers that are in particular foliations?
What did von Mises, I know so little about this. Can somebody summarize what did von Mises actually conclude about how agents form markets?
I don't know in detail.
I have been meaning, I have this very crazy situation. I have all my economics books on the top shelf in my library, and I keep on meaning to get out a ladder and go fetch them down. They've been up there for 20 years, and I just haven't, I just need to, I need to go get the, it's a very practical, oh, is that, what is that book? Sataris, what's the, is that theory of, is that von Mises' theory of value or something?
One of the classics, network, social and economic theory.
What is the book?
Social and economic networks.
Who's it by?
From Michael Jackson.
I do not know that book.
Really?
Is it recent? By the way, your audio has gone out, Sataris.
Sorry. Am I heard now?
More or less, yeah. Is that a recent book, or is that from a long time ago?
not too old, but it's one of the classics in the area. It was written in 2008.
Huh.
I sent you a link in the Slack.
Yes, send it in the chat here. I want to. I'll order myself a copy. I have never heard of catalytics. Okay, catalactics.
Catalytics.
See, this is the danger. This is why I always get so afraid of making up names for things. I had some early in my career. I had some nice Greek names for things, like autoplectic.
Autoplectic. That's right.
Yeah, something that makes complexity by itself, so to speak. Okay, so what does this mean?
These people had to take lots of Latin and Greek in their Viennese high schools. That's the reason why they come up with these.
No doubt, but what? Fair enough. By the way, just to focus.
Perhaps.
Sorry, go ahead.
Perhaps, I don't know if it's worth explaining, but perhaps Sotiris could explain. I mean, catalaxy comes from this this Greek word, which is put in the chat. But perhaps our friend can explain why this Austrian school economist has used this particular Greek term.
I don't know. I'm not really familiar with the etymology and the concept below it.
Hey, just to help, among other things, focus our conversation.
So let me just make a point. I mean, I think it's if we think about you mentioning, can everything be bought or sold for money? That's a little bit like the idealized endpoint. But if you look at how things have been built up from simpler societies, all these things are technologies. They, I personally think that the right way to think about money and all these structures that determine how exchange happens in the economy, they're technologies that satisfy these goals. People want to exchange, and they figure out, it's this particular piece of shell or cattle or whatever is a good, it's a good medium of exchange. And I think we can't really separate. I mean, it's much easier, at least it's much easier to understand these things if we look at like the social technology side of things in terms of like enabling exchange to happen, rather than thinking, what is the essence of money? And it's just, if you do like comparative anthropology, in comparative economic anthropology, you will see that all kinds of money emerges in different societies according to their specific conditions, but it's always facilitating exchange. And in a sense, if you look at cryptocurrencies and smart contracts, it is a little bit the idealized endpoint for these developments. So it's just that I think it's really powerful and helpful to think of these things in terms of technologies.
What do you mean by that? I mean, you're saying that this is enabling some ultimate economic objective, and the money part of it is just some enablement of something that people want to have happen.
Yes.
And
specifically about money.
Yeah, but I mean, the very fact that, I mean, I don't think it's self-evident that money can work. That is, I don't think it will have been, I don't know the history well enough, but I don't think that it is, people who had pigs versus people who had shells versus people who had whatever else. It's not obvious that you will be in a situation where you can exchange anything for anything. I mean, and it isn't there are plenty of societies in which sort of honorificness is not viable for money.
Yes.
So, so there definitely are different currencies, so to speak, which are not interconvertible.
Yes, you have separate domains. And those you can think of there being a general movement towards very fragmented exchange domains. You can exchange within your family, you can exchange with close people, and then you build more and more complex exchange networks towards this homogeneous exchange economy where everything can be bought and sold for money, and you have one universal money that acts as this exchange technology. But the whole process is, once again, the whole process is complicated enough that it determines precisely how these exchange networks get structured in the actual economies.
Yes.
Well,
Well, okay,
you could think about bots that are able to barter, anything against anything. But in fact, if you look at the actual mechanics of markets, the only way people have been able to create exchanges by having one specific good, or or a small number of specific goods, where people come in and out all the time they want to make an exchange. Come into the money, you exchange something into money, and you use your money to buy something else. And I see that as just like some technological constraint to exchange.
so your point is this kind of money as a way of, liquidity is a story of just a technology for exchanging things.
Yes,
And
precisely.
I wonder. Well, listen, just to throw in a few other points.
And you go all the way up, and the fact that it's such a powerful technology. I mean, the way this exchange technology has been built, all the way from simple societies to European capitalism and then global capitalism, is that you create possibilities of exchanging more and more complicated things. I mean, you might at some point be exchanging grain against pigs, and either the grain or the pigs would be the unit of account. But in the end, if you look at today's economy, you're exchanging, extremely complicated sets of claims over, the infinite, the future outcomes of companies or states or things like that. And but basically, it's always the same phenomenon of getting in and out these exchange technologies.
James.
I guess the question is, this was one of the first motivating questions for this whole topic, is if you go back and we think about what branchial space might be for the economic model, and we still haven't agreed on the primitives for the atoms of economic activity. Well, let's suppose that we have some set of primitives, and we're thinking about what an entangled state could be. I guess the question is whether or not you could have that without money, and if you do have it without money, if it would be different, and if it's different,
I think an entangled
how so?
state has to do with incomplete information. I think entangled states is something about, the story of the multi-way system is many things could have happened, and somehow, just like in quantum mechanics, you don't know which actually happened. And then the question would be, in branchial space, those are different outcomes for different things that might have happened. And so an entanglement then is a story of, for example, the merging in branchial space is there are many places, we could have gotten to this place in many different ways. We don't know which one it was, but we got to the same place. We ended up with, the history of how, I don't know, what's a good example? So I mean, I would claim multi-way system is it's about incomplete information. Because if I'm thinking, okay, that would be my take. And then the branchial space story is about different things that could have happened. I mean, branchial space is about different economic outcomes at a particular time. I mean, I don't think we've talked about different economic situations at a particular time. Different economic histories that might have played out. And some of them wind up in very similar places in branchial space. That is, they're very similar economic situations, even though the dynamics of what happened is different, and other ones are far away. And I don't know what the characterization of distance between economic outcomes. I don't really know how to think about that.
And just to rephrase my question in terms of the description you just provided, how does if you were to think of a hypothetical monetary economy and a non-monetary economy, one that uses money, one that doesn't use money, would those branchial spaces, differ? Does the monetary economy have more potentially different economic situations at the same time because you have this medium, this exchangeable kind of medium between all these different goods? That's the basic question.
Yeah, I would think that, I think there is some story about causal invariance and, ending up at the side. I don't know. This is complicated. Boy, this is complicated.
Well, I think the answer to James' question would be definitely yes, because it's one way to think about money is as a technology that enlarges the scope of different exchanges that can be made. And specific one is you have a house, you want to sell your house, and for another house and 2 cars, and maybe there's not going to be a sum of values of these 3 things that are going to be exactly the value of your house. So the barter is not going to happen unless you actually have some kind of technology that enables you to fraction the value of the goods you have. So I think in terms of enlarging the scope of possible exchanges, that's precisely, that's maybe one of the main reasons, not the only one, why money has been developed. And I think it's an incremental process through which, it satisfies some needs in the beginning. And just like any other technology, people discover new ways of using it and make it more efficient and better.
So I have a couple of questions here.
And all the way to cryptocurrencies.
Right. Just one practical thing. We have, when is it? Tuesday evening. My friend Nassim Taleb is going to join us for some kind of discussion. And I think it'll be fun. Nassim will have a certain tendency to try and talk about rather technical things about heavy-tailed distributions. I think it will be more fun to try and talk about economics with him, because he has said to me many times he believes that economics is fundamentally a non-science, non-activity, so to speak. I'm just wondering, Fred, I think are you something of an expert on Nassim's writings and work and so on, or is that?
I've read all his books, all his non-technical books. I haven't read the big Incerto yet, but I'll work through it. But I've read all his books, and I'm a fan.
Okay, so Fred, if you were going to pick topics, because Nassim has a lot of things to talk about, and we've got an infinite number of possible paths there. I'm just curious if you were to pick some topics that you think would be particularly interesting to chat about with this group.
Mm-hmm. With this group,
yeah, I think. Well, similar group. I mean, we'll have other people probably join, but
yeah, there's many actually. There's many. I mean, specifically, Taleb was a trader, as many of you know, and this is an interesting piece of his biography, because he was like a screen trader, and he said, I don't really understand what the price dynamics is at all. I look at the screen, I have no idea what's going on. And so he decided to become a pit trader. He went to Chicago and become a pit trader, one of those people who are screaming at each other's faces. And he has, I can pick that up in a second. He has a quote that's very nice, because what he says is that once I became a pit trader, actually seeing the price formation among humans, that's what it was in the 80s, I think, when he was doing that. Everything that drives price formation within markets, it has nothing to do with value of securities. It has to do with liquidity flow. It has to do with that guy being stuck with an order, and he needs to sell so much, and everybody else senses it, and they kind of like sense his emotions, and he gets squeezed into selling for a lower price than he wished for. So the point is, he would probably, concerning our discussion, he would probably make the point that this hydraulics and dynamics of the actual market structure do have a lot of importance in the way short-term prices are formed. And obviously, he has, in terms of asset pricing, the fact that I mean, there's a whole theory about how asset pricing gets formed, you know, in mainstream economics, and it does assume certain statistical properties of price time series that Taleb basically thinks are unrealistic, and he's totally right. And one of the things that he tries to think is, you know, what is the dynamics when you have when the underlying processes are actually very different from what gets assumed in traditional theory. I'm sure that starting from these points of like mechanics of financial markets, and you can go a long way.
How does that relate to his whole, you know, like I have a friend named John Campbell who used to be the chairman of the economics department at Harvard. Okay, and he just wrote.
I didn't know you're
book.
friends with John Campbell.
What's that?
I didn't know you're friends with John Campbell.
Yeah, I actually know him from elementary school.
Oh, interesting. I sat at one of his courses. It was pretty abstract.
Is he very mathematical? What's that?
His one of the. I mean, he has this book about the econometrics of financial markets, and so his probably like one of the top authorities into mainstream economic theory. So if you could pit Campbell against Taleb, it would be really interesting.
What are you saying? If you could what?
If you could put Campbell and Taleb to discuss, I mean, it would be very interesting.
Maybe I should see if John is around.
Because Campbell has this book, I mean, about asset pricing. So
I know.
He's probably his big authority on mainstream academic asset pricing. All these issues that we're discussing regarding financial assets, obviously not.
Okay,
not
so
general prices.
I got John's book, and I exchanged some mail with him about it because I cannot tell what the hell is going on in this book. In fact, let's see if I can pull up a piece of mail because it's kind of interesting. Because I asked him, okay, so this is going to see. The problem is I know all these people, and I don't necessarily know, I don't know the whole backstory in all cases. Like I've known this guy, John Campbell, since we were. He's a couple of years older than me, so since we were probably like 10 years old or something. So it. But let me just look up. Because I had asked him, hold on a second here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I had asked him about, what is economics? Is economics something that is a sort of an axiomatically based science? Or is it, where you assume certain axioms of human behavior and then you derive things about economic systems? Or is it more something where you are just looking at the statistics of what's going on? Okay, and so let's see. Let's see, I can probably, I'll copy out what he said. Okay, this is, sorry, I'm just, you pose some deep and important questions about what economics is actually doing. A lot of economic theory is axiomatic. Classic example is von Neumann-Morgenstern theory of expected utility. Okay. Starting with maxims.
Yes.
Wait a minute. So what is he saying here? So he's saying that applied models want to use specific parameterized functions. So in other words, it's a kind of an empirical theory of what of what's going on. Okay, what economic theory actually is, not a theory in the physics sense. We can know. Okay, analogy with biology, which is what I had sort of said. Yeah, well, but population ecology is just game theory again. That sort of doesn't count.
I think economics has this thing where with physics you have theoretical and experimental physics. That's like, that interface is really well because there's very large interplay, but it feels like in economics you kind of have three branches, because you have like the axiomatic, which is such as the Austrian school and things like that, and then you have economic history such as Marx that he mentions here, and then you also have experimental economics, which is like behavioral economics, which is kind of an emerging field. But all three of these reject all the other ones as being valid, so they don't have an interplay that you get, for example, in physics, which I think is hampering a bit.
So why do you call behavioral economics experimental?
Well, behavioral economics, well, so the perspective I have of that, my mother's a behavioral economist. So they go out, they do experiments on, okay, they give people situations, they see how they react in that, and then they see what conclusions can they do from that. So for example, they worked on traffic. So the question is, if you have these traffic laws in these areas versus those traffic laws in those areas, how do people react to this, and what are their behaviors with that? So it's very experimental. They actually go into the real world, and usually doing an actual model is with predictive power is usually not an objective, because you say, okay, if you do this, this will happen, but it's not like a function you can analytically continue or something like that.
Right. But so what happened? I mean, like I knew a chap who was studying economics in virtual worlds. And he had unfortunately, he went on, he was a graduate student at Harvard and working with somebody there. And he was sort of going to go on as an academic, but now he's running some big piece of Uber. So he's out of that business. But that was a case, these virtual worlds are a case where you have sort of an economy where you can see every piece of flow. And there was sort of a question of what happens in those cases. And I'm not sure, do you know if there are conclusions from that kind of thing? Do you know if people should have been able to do good experiments in virtual worlds?
Not that I know of specifically, but that seems like, yes. I haven't thought of that before. That seems like a very fruitful way of testing things.
Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, my friend was a chap called Phil Rosedale, who did this thing called Second Life. And I was talking to him about the currency in Second Life, okay? And one of the things is that the velocity of money in Second Life is very high compared to the velocity of money in a real economy. And there was a question of, is there a central bank in Second Life? Do you need a central bank in Second Life? And his claim was he just had one person who was just controlling the money supply in Second Life, and it had all been rather easy. And he was kind of surprised at how difficult people find it in real world economics compared to the money supply in Second Life. I mean, I don't know whether, I guess he has a bunch of data on that. I mean, I think it may be one of these things where people have data, but it's all sort of deep inside the proprietary details of some particular virtual world. And interesting. Well, but okay, so with respect to, I wonder, I think it's an ambush if I try and get John Campbell to show up for this discussion. I wonder whether they've ever met. Do you think they would have met? Or
perhaps sometimes they'll have talks too, those joint talks with finance people. Probably not, but they definitely know about each other.
Okay. But can you summarize? I mean, I was really seriously confused by John Campbell's book, what the hell it is. I mean, because he has very detailed mathematical analysis and he has all these charts of things. And I know, his other gig is that he actually works on practical, he has a partner in a large, in something that manages, I guess, I don't know whether he's still, they're still managing a chunk of the Harvard endowment, but they're a big management company.
Yeah, it's large, yeah.
You're
essentially abstracting from all these detailed features of securities, and you're looking at, aggregate structures of payoffs. And the first paragraph is about, what is the preferred structure? What is the preferred return structure of payoffs for agents when you have uncertainty? And it's all about having markets where you exchange contracts upon uncertain outcomes. And how do you actually fit the, you fit your portfolio to your specific preference among these.
So you assume something about the underlying dynamics of the market, like you assume
yes, you
some
definitely.
Gaussian variation or something.
Yes.
And
You
then
assume
say,
a regular stochastic process, and then you work all the way back so that you optimize your preferences over possible outcomes.
So in some sense, what's happening there, we keep on looking for a so one trade-off, the multi-way system for economics. In a sense, the aggregate multi-way system is that Gaussian distribution. The aggregate, each branch in the multi-way system is an actual outcome, but the aggregate behavior of the whole thing is the stochastic story.
Yes. I think one really important point is that if you're looking at John Campbell's book, he's basically abstracting from everything in the economy. He's not looking at production. He's not looking at consumption. He's just looking at financial assets. He's just looking at assets that have non-probabilistic outcomes over time. And he's not really looking at the reasons, the whole bunch of like real economy reasons why different kinds of assets would have different outcomes. He may be connecting this to, macroeconomics and, why, depending on some pattern of growth in the economy, equity stocks would do better than bonds and things like that. But it's in a very aggregate and abstract level. So basically what he's doing is he's assuming some kind of structure of returns in financial assets. And he's working all the way back to say, how do you make decisions? How do agents make decisions on top, given that they know about the, when you say it's the agents actually know what the underlying processes are, which Taleb will say is a fallacy because you don't know. You don't even know what the processes are. You can even make, even some basic statistic, assumptions about these processes, such as, it doesn't even have a standard deviation according to Taleb. Right. These are in traditional asset pricing financial theory, these are well-behaved processes. And how much can you derive in terms of like thinking about what would be the optimizing behavior of an agent given these processes, and how could you aggregate the behavior of different agents so that would there be an equilibrium of agents that have, identical preferences or different preferences, and that's, tweaking the models and saying, if some agents have this, they prefer risk, they are willing to take a lot of risk in order so that they have a lot of much better returns, and some of them will be less risk taking. And this is where he's talking about the lotteries back there, Van Neumann Morgan's theory of expected utility, because they have you build utilities on top of outcomes of stochastic processes, and the whole theory builds upon that. And it does get really complicated, and that's precise. And what I think is interesting is that Taleb is coming from a very different perspective from this real world perspective. Taleb thinks that doesn't fit. Not only that's not the best theory, but that the fact that market players assume that theory, assume that the prices of financial assets have this behavior, is itself a cause of instability in the financial system.
So let me see if I can summarize this a little bit. So what you're saying is that for John Campbell, it is effectively axiomatic that there is a Gaussian distribution of prices in the market. Is that right?
Yes. Obviously, the academics make things a little more complicated, and they will look at, other kinds of stochastic processes. But basically, they will look at well-behaved stochastic processes. Okay. Taleb says, this is wild. This is, it's wild out there. You can't do that. If you don't do that, if you don't assume well-behaved processes, then the whole edifice collapses. Okay, so then Taleb's technical books are about what happens when, his particular thing is heavy-tailed distributions, which are not Gaussian, right? Yes. And so then the technical aspects of his books, I would assume, have to do with building a John Campbell-like structure without the assumption of Gaussian variation. Yes, and a lot of what he talks about is why John Campbell's books, and taking John Campbell as an example, why this kind of books, basically they completely break down if you assume fat-tail distributions instead of well-behaved distributions. I see. And then, so then what he's saying is that so then, for example, in our case, in the multi-way system, we can imagine,
Okay, so a trivial grid-like multi-way system will lead to a Gaussian, many kinds of things you can compute will then be Gaussians, because you essentially have a binomial distribution. I mean, in other words, the multi-way system, in some very trivial example, you would essentially just have a grid graph that represents, the different paths, and you'd end up with probably just a binomial tree type story. It will be binomial distribution, Gaussian for all the usual reasons. Okay, so then in a Talebian idea for this, the point would be that the multi-way system would no longer have such a simple form. It would have wilder pieces to it.
Yes.
That correspond. Go ahead.
And the topology of the multi-way system would be very weird, because if in some branches, because if you talk about fat tail distributions, you're going to have very rare events with very big impact. So, maybe many regions of the multi-way system will be nice and regular, but some regions will be very weird because of the impact of individual events within the multi-way.
Right. Well, so what that would mean is, we could actually work that out. I mean, it's a question of weighting of paths. What you're saying is that there would be a bridge, basically, that would be a narrow bridge that takes you to quite a heavily weighted area of the multi-way system, far away from other things.
Yes, and if you want to take an average, for instance, if you want to take some measure of the multi-way system, Taleb is going to say, this rare large event is so dominant that it's going to skew every possible measure, every possible measure that you want to take of the system. So you can't really say anything on aggregate about how it's going to behave.
Well, so what it is it's an entropy versus, you're saying it's a rare event, but if you take a mean, for example, that rare event has such a large value, gives you such a large value that in terms of the mean, if not the median, it will be a big contributor.
Yes, it's going to skew. So you can't really say, what's going to be the mean of this, of this value that I'm taking over the entire system. I think his point, this gets technical and I'm not really sure about this, but I think what he's going to say is that it's just completely dominated by the marginal events. So all the averages that you're taking are basically going to be meaningless with respect to the actual behavior of the system.
Okay, so but the claim would be means are dominated by rare big events.
Definitely, yes.
But what about medians? And is our financial markets is what matters to finance somehow for some reason means, not medians? Why does robust statistics not what matters to financial markets?
Also,
you're always exposed you're exposed to the extreme events. I think you can't really if you're exposed to the extreme event all the time, you can't really rely you can't really rely either on the mean or the median, because your outcomes are going to depend on whether the extreme event happens or not.
So Sotaris is pointing out the robust statistics is their problems of tractability. Yeah, so I don't know what the computational complexity of doing these different things is. That will be interesting to know. I don't know.
And the other thing is that, Taleb is very much into, this is probably for other fields other than economics, but what he's really interested in is in the probabilistic structure of the world. He takes financial markets as a starting point, but he expands this into everything that's relevant and touched by fat-tailed phenomena. And one thing that I think that, one bridge that I would really like to make is between what we see in NKS, all the origins of randomness that we've seen, emerging from computational systems, and how does this actually bridge all the way to Taleb's world of strange distributions? Is there like a nice conceptual and computational bridge that one could make that goes all the way from the underlying computational phenomena to the probabilistic statistical world that Taleb
yeah, I think one of the points though, that's a good
into.
point. That's a good point. There are plenty of cases where there is no meaningful probabilistic estimate. For example, there are cases where a tiny seed in a cellular automaton will eventually take over the system. And that's a case where the usual probabilistic analysis will break down. And, you know, if, in other words, if you do statistical mechanics, so the question would be, what is the relationship between what Taleb is doing and sort of equilibrium statistical mechanics versus this sort of, you know, something like a seeded phase change or something? You know, there's you suddenly seed the ice crystal and eventually you get, you know, everything turns to ice type thing, which is not something you would normally see in the ordinary flow of the statistics of the situation. Yes, that's interesting. I mean, so what you're saying is, you know, in a sense, what we've addressed a lot with NKS is kind of how does a deterministic underlying system appear to be random? Whereas I think what Taleb is saying is there's a lot you don't know about the world. And so what he's dealing with is more, in your terminology, the hydraulic aspects of the world. That is, given that something happens, there's a set of things that might happen. And given, I mean, you know, in a sense, in NKS, we're looking at the, you know, we're assuming a deterministic underlying world. And then we're asking what kinds of things can happen in such a world. Whereas he's assuming, in some sense, an ultimately probabilistic world.
Yes, exactly.
What is the correspondence between those things? How does one think
exactly.
about it?
I mean, the point is that, I mean, while a lot of people doing, you know, statistical modeling of the world, they will assume a well-behaved, you know, probabilistic world. What Taleb does is he goes one step farther and say, you know, what happens if we assume a badly behaved, a wildly behaved probabilistic world where, you know, the distributions are wild, or we don't even have enough information about the distributions. And the interesting question would be, what kinds of deterministic computational process how would you go all the way from, you know, the basic underlying deterministic computational process to the wild distributions that Taleb uses to model the world? And I think what he does is an excellent job of translating, if you assume a world that's governed where, you know, there is a lot of wild distributions, what are the consequences for the real life, not just financial markets and economics? And I think this is what I think is his conceptual shtick.
So what is the relationship between that and computational irreducibility? I mean, in other words, what he's saying is there is a wildness in some sense. Okay, there is an unpredictability to the distribution of things, and that feels a bit like computational irreducibility.
Yes, precisely.
So one might say, okay, so the issue, sort of the Taleb theory, so to speak, is, you know, is the probabilistic distribution reducible, is one question. That would be for him a question. Or does it have aspect? I mean, so he might say, you know, first point, you know, is it heavy-tailed and other things like that? The next point is, how wild is it? You know, because it could be much wilder than that. And I suppose that but I'm not sure that you know, for me, it's kind of a, you know, for the NKS point of view, it's you know, one is always thinking about a deterministic underlying system, which he's fundamentally not thinking about.
But he's not excluding it. He's just saying, you know, I'm not looking below the hood of the distribution. I don't really care what's generating this randomness. I'm just assuming that it exists.
Okay, so let's take the pandemic as an example. Okay, what he will say, he was talking a lot about heavy-tailed distributions at the beginning of the pandemic, and saying a bunch of things I didn't really believe in, actually. You know, the only point I could make is you know, what will happen may have pieces of computational irreducibility to it. That is, that it may not be easy, given, you know, if you go beyond the SIR models or something, once you have a true model, it may be hard to determine what is going to happen in the model based on, even given that you have the model, it may not be obvious what's going to happen. Now, I don't know, how does that relate to anything that he's talking about? I don't know that it really does. I mean, to say that there's I suppose it does, because it's saying that it's the distribution of outcomes. If you could say what would happen in the model to the point where you know it's Gaussian distributed, where you now know certain aspects of, certain measurements will be Gaussian distributed, then then that is a statement of computational reducibility. To say that you don't know what it's going to do is ultimately going to be a statement of the fact that it isn't, that there isn't a way to I mean, all right, what other, I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, I've had these discussions with Nassim about a little bit about economics, in which he's very vehemently believes that sort of all economic theory is nonsense. I don't know whether that's for technical reasons, because he just thinks, I mean, so basically from his point of view, the axiomatic basis of John Campbell's book is completely flawed, because it is based on this assumption of essentially Gaussian. I mean, it is a strange thing that, tons of kind of conclusions about medical tests and things are based on assumptions about Gaussianness, and sort of they're all wrong, so to speak.
Right.
But
I think that's what he thinks brings the edifice down.
Fair enough.
I just want to make a quick comment. There's another development in economics that I know that Taleb finds to be quite interesting, and that is the contribution made by Murray Gell-Mann to the theory of economics with respect to his theory of non-ergodicity. So what Taleb is interested in is...
You just told me something very interesting, because I knew Murray for many, many years, and I did not think he made any useful contribution outside of physics whatsoever.
I think he's made a useful contribution to
okay,
economics.
well, this is great. And I wrote a whole obituary about him, and I basically said I didn't think he made any contribution outside of physics. Okay, so you're about to correct me, which is great. All right.
So I'll explain kind of Taleb's interpretation of Gell-Mann's paper, which I can share to the chat in just a moment.
Yeah.
So for Taleb, what's interesting is that if you have, let's say you just have human actors, and human actors are making decisions. Over time, as humans are making decisions, for Taleb, the variance is going to increase, and you're going to get farther and farther from say the average or the mean. And you're not necessarily going to return to that average again, because you're continuing to get deeper and deeper into a particular, say, path. And I think that this idea of non-ergodicity actually has some purchase in the multi-way graph model in the following sense. If you have the economy can go in different directions. If you're an observer in a given economy, you are along some particular path. And so in some ways, you're kind of rather deeply evolved into some particular path. And so I think the kind of Gell-Mann Taleb interpretation is, I mean, one, you can think about irreducibility. You could think about the fact that the logical depth of having evolved into this particular branch is irreducible, but also in the sense that you can't just view yourself as being... Taleb particularly doesn't like the idea that you can sample over possible worlds as an economic observer. For him, you're somewhat locked into some particular path that's defined by some evolution of decisions and economic activity, which we could model in our multi-way graph. And because of that, you're going to be exposed to events that you might kind of disregard if you took a Gaussian point of view. But that's simply we could even interpret that as being you're going to make observations that are going to reflect the conditions of your particular path, as opposed to, say, the whole multi-way causal graph. So I think this idea of non-ergodicity could be quite important.
Well, explain what Murray, I mean, so non-ergodicity, normally, if something is ergodic, it means that over the course of time, it will sample all possible states. So non-ergodicity, a very typical example of non-ergodicity, like the stuff I was studying recently about consensus formation in distributed consensus formation, is a good example, or any phase anytime there's a phase transition, you have non-ergodicity. The thing doesn't sample all possible states. It's just a solid. It's just, of some particular form. So what was Murray's point about economics and non-ergodicity?
The basic point is that you shouldn't necessarily expect your actions to average out in the end, or that you're going to in the end sample the entire sample space, because your actions do carry consequences, and you do find yourself going along some particular path of having made one decision after another. That's a very kind of
okay, but look, there's a couple of points here. In statistical mechanics, there's the whole story of, the ergodic hypothesis is the hypothesis that sampling all possible states, that over time you sample all possible states. And moreover, the kind of more microscopic version of that is that even over a fairly short period of time, you will have sampled states typical of the whole ensemble. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Basic result of the second law of thermodynamics is this idea that you're kind of, you quickly evolve to something which is typical of the ensemble. So what you're saying here is that what Murray is saying, which is kind of, that in economic behavior, the dynamics of economic behavior do not lead you to a thermodynamic maximum state. That is, they do not lead you to a state in which you're sampling sort of at random across all possible economic circumstances. That is, that the dynamics of the actual dynamics of the evolution affect, the ultimate thermodynamic limit is not reached by the actual dynamics of human actors in the system. And I think this is what we see in endless NKS type systems, that we see that the actual dynamics don't, okay, the question is, do you get to, okay, so this is apparently a Gaman, I did not know Murray had done, really, it's interesting. Okay, so, ergodicity is not achieved by economic activity in some sense, or alternatively said, the economy does not obey the second law of thermodynamics.
And just to add a more specific detail to it, in particular, they look at wealth. The accumulation of wealth or gaining wealth is not an ergodic process in the economy. I don't know if that helps to clarify it.
Yeah. Actually, Phil Rosedale sent me a thing recently. He has a simulation of wealth. Actually, this is kind of interesting. He has a simulation of wealth acquisition. Let me try and find it. Okay, that's it. The ergodicity problem. Okay, this is yeah. Okay, let me just find this thing from Phil. See if I can find the I gotta find this. This was interesting, and I would be interested in your point of view about this. Philip Rosedale. Let's see whether we can find Phil's. He had this simulation. No, all posts. He had a simulation of wealth acquisition. This must be. Come on, where is it? Just see. What he had was a bunch of a bunch of particles bouncing around. Anybody find it? Let's see. I see that if I search for his name in wealth, I get a bunch of things about exits from companies and things. That doesn't really work. Drat. Anyway, what he was doing was he was looking at, he had a particular model where agents would interact with each other. I need to find this model because this was a oh, come on, we got to be able to find this. Anybody's searching skills up to finding this? Let's see. Rosedale wealth distribution. Model.
I found something. I don't know if it's what you're looking for.
Yeah, this is the right thing. Yeah, this is I think this is the thing. Let's see.
Or actually, it might be a follow-up to this one.
Yes, that's the thing. So this is, let me just see here. I think he had a simulation. There we go. Okay, so what happens here is it's some interaction where there's some maximum where two things interact, and I forget what the exact model is. Maybe he has a link to the actual thing that you can run. It's a simple model. It's a simple sort of hard sphere gas where there is some what actually happens here? Let's see. Flip of a coin to determine who gets, oh, okay. Pick a random amount of money that is less than the amount held by the poorer of the two. Then flip a coin to determine who gives that amount to the other. If that makes sense. This was the code. Oh, how do I actually run it? Maybe I press the run button. Okay. So can I run it? Oh, what just happened? Why did it start doing that? Okay, so at every transaction, it picks a random amount less than the smaller of the size of the smaller thing in the interaction, and it randomly gives money. I'm sure this is a kind of an obvious, if you write down the mean field theory of this, I'm sure it's obvious why this works this way. Okay, so this is a case where we're getting very non-thermodynamic behavior, so to speak, of the system. We're getting very non-second law type behavior. Interesting. Okay. Anyway, so you know, you guys are almost making me feel like I should collect a bunch of my random friends, like the Phil Rosedales of this world and the John Campbells and the Nassim Talebs, who will never have met each other and who have different points of view about these kinds of questions. But I think that's ambush. I don't do that. We'll do that another time. The Satara says, let's do the party. Yeah, right. The seems like the fact that there's a zero-sum game is significant, Jean is saying. I mean, I think I'm pretty sure this is an easy physics thing to analyze. And in fact, Phil thought it probably was too. He just doesn't know how to do it. And I think you just have to write down, two distribution functions. And it's like at every collision, yeah, it's got to be something very much like the standard derivation of the Boltzmann equation, but it won't be the Boltzmann equation because of the way it's being set up. But so the basic point being made here is what you're saying is, what's being said is thermodynamic behavior that has simple Gaussian statistical distributions isn't the way the world actually works. And what in a sense we're saying with NKS is that not only is that simple approximation not the way the world actually works, but it's really hard to figure out how the world actually works. In other words, Nassim might be saying the approximation to how the world works that people have been using to derive this whole mathematical stack isn't right. But you might still hold out the hope that there is an idealization of the world that can let you know what's going to happen. And what, in a sense, NKS is saying is that even that isn't going to work out. Now, I don't know what one is saying here. What one's saying here in this kind of observer-based sort of fourth epoch of science kind of idea is that even in the case where there is computational irreducibility, if you look at the right thing, you can still get some reducible result. So then one question is, what is the right thing in economics? So it could be that certain things, it could be that if you look at the wrong thing in space-time, you don't observe Einstein's equations in any kind of regularity at all. You observe all this random irreducible stuff happening. And it could be that, so the objection to what Taleb is saying is that maybe there is a feature of economics that is reducible. And if you ask the right thing, so maybe the issue is what humans care about in economics, is it reducible or not? It could be that humans have put themselves in a place in economics where the thing they care about is something reducible, or it could be that humans have forced themselves into a situation where the things they care about have a bunch of irreducibility to them. I mean, I don't know what, but I also don't know, I mean, in a sense, what Nassim is talking about then is, he's talking about what the Einstein equations of economics might be like. What we're talking about is what the kind of underlying, the machine code underneath those equations might be like, perhaps. Okay. Okay, so Allison's pointing out that Phil had said there was another post in which oh yeah, that's right. He was going to do some universal basic income experiment. Somebody else I know is doing was doing a universal basic income experiment in Oakland, California, actually. That's the chap, oh my God, what's his name? One of the founders of Instagram, not Kevin, the other guy. Oh, I've forgotten. Anyway, well, anyway, we've been going a while here. So although this is interesting, we probably should wrap up soon. And I think, I mean, the part that is, oh boy, the part that is, the question is there a basic science of economics? What is its machine code? What kinds of things can be derived in economics? I mean, Taleb is saying there's lots of stuff, John Campbell is saying you can derive everything from Gaussians. Taleb is saying, no, that doesn't work. There are these heavy-tailed distributions. And then there's probably another theory that you can get for heavy-tailed distributions. And then one might be saying, oh, it's irreducibility all the way down, nothing can be derived. But then one might say, but humans choose their environment in such a way that they can have an experience of that they can experience things that are somewhat predictable. Because if everything about the world was utterly unpredictable, people wouldn't have any idea what to do, so to speak. And so they're sampling pieces that are somewhat predictable. And then the question is, can economics make a theory about those predictable parts without getting thrown into all of the vastly unpredictable stuff? Oh, Mike Krieger is the person with the universal basic income. Yeah, you're right. The Sataras, maybe last comment or two here. What?
I have this question that I put in the chat. For example, can we speak of relative reducibility, so to speak of a system that for humans, because in conjunction as well to the bounded rationality concept we discussed earlier. For example, that ants cannot reduce, let's say, the field where they're searching for food. They have to do an exhaustive search, but a human may be able to discern some patterns and do this work maybe more efficiently. So we have reducibility.
We don't have a theory of this. I mean, this is the question of this is sort of the theory of abstraction type question of where are there sort of shortcuts? What are the lemmas that you need to add to make it possible to jump ahead with something? We do not have a theory of that. We would like to have a theory of that. Boy, we've got some serious intellectual stuff, because tomorrow we have a conversation with Greg Chaitin about very different kinds of things. I think we'll talk probably more about foundations of math and foundations of science there. Yeah, look, I suppose the meta point here is in a fairly long career of doing different kinds of things, I have run across lots of interesting people. The only sad part about it is that like you're telling me things about John Campbell where I have no contextualization. I've known this person for like 50 years and I have no real, I know, I do, there was a funny story when back in the early 1990s, I was thinking of taking our company public, and John was a economics professor in Princeton at that time. And, I happened to be talking to him and I'm thinking of taking the company public. And he said, well, I've just written this paper, at least a draft of a paper about why underwriters systematically underprice IPOs. Okay. So I go to all these meetings with these investment bankers, complete with this draft of, I think it was not published at that point, this draft of this paper with all these charts about how all the underwriters underprice IPOs. That was just it was just an interesting social dynamic, so to speak, because they were like, no, all the other guys underprice IPOs, but we don't. And
you strengthen your bargaining position.
Yes, I did. Yes, definitely. No, I know. And it was funny because I mean, in the end, I didn't take the company public, which was probably just as well, but it was definitely, we could have gotten a good deal from the investment bankers. I'm glad I didn't take the company public. Right. By the way, I will just add one more thing. So, part of the reason I've been interested in this economic theory is the possibility of creating a distributed blockchain that is there a way, if one understood more about what economics is, does that allow one to think more about, so for example, in a sense, and I don't really know how to think about this, but in a sense, traditional blockchain is kind of a single, I don't know, it is always maintaining this consistent sense of value in some sense, rather than allowing a distributed network of things. And so my vision for this has been that the economic system is knitted together by events as space-time, as space is knitted together by events. And that my vision had been this distributed blockchain in which there are autonomous events that knit together the structure of the economic system, and intentional events that are what humans are adding into the system. Anyway, this is probably a topic for another day, because I then regressed into feeling that I needed to understand more about economics. I mean, we've got an implementation of some pieces of this distributed blockchain, and we've got also these pieces of the sort of quantum money thing where you don't have a definite value for money because of basically branchial, differences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that's we've got some pieces of this, but I feel like I don't really understand it until I understand more about economics. And just to add another little piece of flavor to the whole thing, we've also been looking a bunch at NFTs and at this possibility of having a whole world of live minted NFTs and so on. That's a topic for another day. The world of how do NFTs, which are in a sense many different forms of money. It's like every different bank is issuing their own version of money, and then there's a question of interconvertibility of NFTs, and are they? I don't know. There's a whole long story of this, but we should probably wrap up here, and it's I think we shed most of our participants, which I think is probably as it should be. But anybody got any last comments on this?
Just one, which was just for your own notes. I attached 2 articles. One of them was by Wolfram, or sorry, one was by Gelman and a collaborator. The other one was just by his collaborator. And you attached that second one to your notebook, but I'll just include here, this is the one that Gelman wrote with this other person named Peters. So if you're interested in knowing particularly what Gelman had to say, it's this one that I just attached.
I will add that to my notes. Thank you. Let's say, there we go.
One last comment I want to make about transactions that we can discuss in another moment, I mean another day, is how important is the structure of the transaction, or how like in Bitcoin, I'm thinking about Bitcoin. Like when you say you send Bitcoin, you're actually not sending Bitcoin. You are just like changing who is the owner of something in the blockchain. There are other blockchains where you actually do kind of send stuff. So I think a lot about that.
Why does that matter?
That's my question. If that matters or not, if that's independent of the economy, or
what do you mean by sending something, really? I mean, aren't you just attaching a different address is now recorded as the owner on the blockchain?
Not in Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, it's a little bit different. Like when you use this UTXO structure, it's a bit different than Ethereum, for example, where you have an address with a balance.
Okay. What is that? Sorry. So in Ethereum, there's an address and it has a balance.
Mm-hmm.
And in Bitcoin?
In Bitcoin, you don't have addresses. Addresses are an abstraction on top of the blockchain. What you have are unspent outputs with attached to public keys, and there are only there's only one private key that can you can say unlock an output to create a new one locked to another key.
So in other words, you have this whole thread of, in order to know what's going on in Bitcoin, you have to trace through this whole thread of where these different things went. Whereas,
that's what wallets do. They keep track of all your outputs. In an Ethereum wallet is different because you can just ask the address to give you the balance, basically.
Right. Yeah, I don't know whether that's significant or not. I mean, they may be different ways of describing value and so on. Anyway, for another day. Well, thanks all. Happy for those who are the American crowd here, which may be the minority. Happy 4th of July and so on. And for anybody who isn't explicitly on these mailing lists, like I think Fred probably isn't, we should make sure you have the information for the for Greg Chaitin, if you want to come to that, and Taleb, where
Yes.
you should definitely come to Taleb. I think
Yes, I will.
All right. Well, look forward to seeing you all soon, and talk to you another time. Okay.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.